Okay, welcome to CSEC. It's a particular pleasure for me to have a chance to chair this session today and to invite my longtime friend, Professor Shiri Krebs, whom I met when she was a doctoral student here at Stanford.
Before I was a doctoral student.
Even before she was a doctoral student. I think we're now at an age where it's considered polite not to say the year in which this happened, but it's been quite some time. Shiri, and I'm going to use her first name, not Professor Krebs, just because of this long connection, currently serves as Professor of Law at Deakin University and co-lead of the Law and Policy theme at the Australian Government Cybersecurity Cooperative Research Centre. She's also chair of the American Society of International Law's International Libre Society on the Law of Armed Conflict, and she is, of course, an affiliate here at CSAC. Shiri is also an Australian Research Council Fellow and an Alexander von Humboldt experienced researcher. Shiri's research focuses on international law and counterterrorism with a focus, as I believe we'll hear today, on behavioral and empirical legal studies. Her current research projects explore the effects of predictive technologies on preventive counterterrorism measures, focusing on the intersection of law, science, and technology. Shiri's work has been highly influential with real-world relevance, something that we all aspire to, and she's been deeply engaged in sharing her research with practitioners in both national militaries in multiple countries and as well with a number of international organizations. She's a prolific scholar whose work has appeared in leading law journals like the International Review of the Red Cross and in numerous edited volumes. Her work has been recognized with such international and national research awards as the Academic Researcher of the Year Award in Australia in 2022, the David Caron Prize from the American Society of International Law in 2021, the Australian Legal Research Awards in 2022, and the Vice Chancellor's Mid-Career Research Award for Career Excellence from Deakin University, her home university, in 2022. Shiri, as we've heard, has earned her doctorate and her master's in law degrees from Stanford Law School. Before that, she received her LLB and her first master's degree from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And of course, she's no stranger to CSEC. She was a postdoctoral international security residential fellow here in year not to be stated. So please join me in welcoming Shiri Krebs back to Stanford.
Thank you. So should I, yeah. Thank you so much, Ellen, for this very detailed and kind introduction. It's always a pleasure to be back at CSAC and to speak to the community. I think I specifically wanted to present this particular paper because of its very interdisciplinary theme. And I think that the reason why most of my studies are very interdisciplinary in nature is partly to be attributed to my years as a CSEC fellow and to the inspiration and feedback that I received here. I'm already missing here in the room today two of my CSEC mentors, Lee Ross and Charles Perot, that passed recently. And I'm very, very grateful for both, kind of their inspiration and impact on my work, but everyone here at the CSEC community as well. So with that in mind, this is a very kind of in progress, let's say, work that is also a part of an edited volume on international legal theories and the behavioral turn. And so while the book project as a whole kind of covers different IR theories or theories of international law and trying to kind of bring interdisciplinary relevance to some of those theories, thinking about how behavioral economics and cognitive behavioral studies may influence or contribute to more traditional theories of international law. I was assigned within this bigger project to try and find some ways in order to merge critical legal studies with behavioral economic approaches to international law. And at the beginning of this project, I thought this is quite a challenging task, considering the very different approaches. But at the same time, I think at this point, kind of delving back into some of those theories, I hope to convince you that there are some way to merge after all. So I will start. I promised Alan that I won't take all the time that I was allocated, so I'll try to be brief as I present kind of some of the basic of international law and data practices. I will then explore some critiques developed by critical theory and critical international law approaches. I will briefly touch upon some of the behavioral insights and how they affect international humanitarian law. I will then talk a little bit about some of the tensions but also the contributions between those very different approaches. And I will end with a proposition of developing a behavioral critique of international humanitarian law. And as I mentioned, very kind of preliminary work in progress. So it's a perfect time to completely, destroy everything I just say and to provide some sincere critique. Okay, so a few words on international law and data practices. And I think here I mainly want to convey the profound ways in which developing and emerging data practices change how we practice and how we think about international law in the context of armed conflict. And so firstly, I think one way that I think emerging technologies influence international humanitarian law is through the jurisdiction of the law. And while legal scholars think about jurisdiction as a very kind of legalistic matter of, where the law, of the authority of the law and its competence, in critical security studies, we started thinking about the jurisdiction of the law in a way that looks at people applying the law and the different ways in which law trickles down to decision-making processes at different levels. So, for example, thinking about how emerging technologies change the jurisdiction of international humanitarian law or the law of armed conflict would be through daily practices of military decision makers, including targeteers, including drone pilots, including new roles that we have, like TV operators, right, and all sorts of different roles that we have now, mission specialists that are using emerging technologies in order to apply the law in different contexts. For example, if we're thinking about a targeted killing operation, then we would have the lawyers who are, prolific about the rules, kind of the normative layer of the law, which would mean we have to apply the basic norms of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. But then in order to apply these norms in particular context, we then have all sorts of non-lawyers, specialists that would use different technologies to provide the data and to apply the norms, and even to tell us what do we need to do to comply with the norm. And so I'll just to explain this a little in more detail, I think about it as three layers in which digital technologies shape the way we apply international humanitarian law. The first is through fact-finding, right? Law would be meaningless without, so the general rules are quite, abstract, and to provide meaning into particular scenarios, we have to have the facts. So what type of data do we have in order to target a particular individual? What activity is attributed to the person? Who is the person? Do we have, a clear identification? What is the level of threat that the person poses, right? So we have to collect data, and we collect this data more and more through different technologies, including aerial vision, including algorithms to predict collateral damage estimates, and so forth. The second layer would be the scope of the legal rule themselves. So for example, if we think about the general norm of precaution, it requires armies to do everything feasible in order to make sure that we have the right identification, for example. And so what does it mean, everything feasible? that might change depending on the type of technological capabilities that the military has. And then lastly, in thinking about proof and certainty, or thinking about how certain decision makers are in the decisions that they make, in the factual framework that they have. And so while generally burden of proof is quite flexible in context of law of armed conflict, it is even more flexible or vague, let's say, when we apply algorithms, predictive algorithms, in order to determine where levels of certainty in the facts that we have. And this is, partly, a problem in every type of regime that determines, that attempts to predict the future. There's always some level of uncertainty that's involved. But when we have predictive algorithms that their error level is not necessarily clear, depending on the context where we apply them. Okay, so this was just kind of a basic introduction of how prevalent data practices are in international law and how they deeply influence every aspect of the application of international humanitarian law. So a few words on critical approaches, and because of time, I'm just going to be brief about this, but happy to come back to any of that during Q&A. And so for this project, I focused on three types of critical approaches, and I think more generally, as I try to define critical approaches to international law for this book chapter, I started, I thought there is a book project on its own about defining, critical approaches to international law. And one of the problems that I had is the clash, I think, even between critical theory, kind of the more Foucaultian approach to critique, and then the more kind of political project of CLS, of critical legal studies, that perhaps is more closely related to 12, that approaches to international law, which I elaborate more. And so if I take a 12 approach to kind of the 12 critical lens, it would think about how we have systemic bias. So the main claim would be international humanitarian law is a biased system. It is biased in favor of first world countries. It is biased against third world countries. And the type of violence that international humanitarian law legitimizes is typically the type of violence that is inflicted by first world countries towards third world countries. Now, the other type of critique, and here I have two types of critiques that kind of come more from the tradition of critical theory. One of them is post-human feminism, and in this sense, I've looked or have applied some of the work by Donna Haraway, thinking about situated knowledges and looking at military technologies and attempt to present technologies as neutral or objective elements, so Haraway calls it a God trick, because even if we have an aerial view, it is always situated, the view, the lens is situated, it provides a very particular part of reality that is not neutral or external to the decision maker as we might have wanted to believe. And lastly, the third part of critique that I will be using today is critical geography, thinking about works like James Scott's work on seeing like a state, which Gregory then applied to the context of military, thinking like a military, or seeing like a military, and thinking about how different vision technologies or technologies of vision limit how we see and what we see, and how this lens provides particular way to generate threat and to see humans in conflict zones in particular categories that would then go back to be consistent with the legal categories applied by international humanitarian law, and how we distinguish between civilians and combatants or non-civilians or people directly participating in hostilities through the lens of technology. Okay, so that was just, very briefly, some critical approaches to international law. And my task was to think about how behavioral economics or cognitive behavioral studies might contribute to those types of critique. And so just a few words also on what does it mean, or what is the scope of cognitive behavioral approaches to international humanitarian law. And so here in the paper, I elaborate on 3 types of biases that I include in thinking about how to contribute to critical studies. The first one is bias in the design of the law. So can we think about different framing effects that the law have? For example, if we have a treaty design decision that would prefer the status quo and opt in or an opt out, that might influence whether states or the rate of states that are willing to join a particular regime, like, for example, the jurisdiction of the ICJ, International Court of Justice. Another type of bias is not related to the legal, to the design of the legal norm itself, but it's a kind of more general decision-making biases, cognitive biases that any human actor applying the law would bring into that application. So for example, if we have confirmation bias, meaning that we would tend to interpret incoming information based on the prior knowledge that we have, that would change how we, for example, interpret intelligence information. And so, and lastly, the type of particular type of biases that I explore in my own research is technical or technology-related biases, like automation bias would mean that humans tend to prefer or tend to trust the outcomes of automated processes more than it's rational to do. And saliency bias, which means that humans tend to place more attention at particular type of information based on different types of signals that information has. So these are 3 types of biases that I explore more generally in other studies, and today I will use in order to develop behavioral critique. And so just as a kind of thinking about whether those very different and distinct approaches can come together, the reason why I think they could is that they share a common ground, which is bias and subjectivity. I think both critical approaches to international law and cognitive behavioral approaches to international law reject the idea that law is objective, that law is external to the humans who apply it, and in that sense, kind of different from more traditional positivist approaches to international law. And so both have this aspiration or aim to expose some of the subjectivities ingrained in legal regimes and the biases, whether structural bias, systemic bias, or kind of more individual-based cognitive bias that changes the application of law in different contexts. So this is where, you know, we can have some sort of a shared kind of common ground. But beyond that common ground, there are significant kind of divergences or differences between those approaches that make it more challenging to inform one another, which perhaps explains why studies in both approaches kind of emerged in almost, you know, scholarly silos so far. So the first tension is the universalist approach of cognitive behavioral studies, which, you know, are also very Western in their origin, and think about research as something that is grounded in fact, that can be, you know, uncovered through empirical inquiry using accepted methodologies, which are universal in the sense that we accept those kind of scientific backgrounds. In contrast, critical theory has a more kind of localized approach to knowledge production, thinking about knowledge production in its very situated context, so not so much universalist in that sense. it is also skepticist with regard to the empirical project, because first, I think in critical theory more generally, the arguments are not necessarily built upon the notion that we can prove them, right? So you can have a critique that is disconnected from the question whether we can prove it or not empirically. But even if we accept that, and if we want to kind of push that a little further and try to figure that out, the idea that the approach to fact-finding within critical theory is also somewhat different, thinking more deeply into how facts are constructed socially rather than kind of found through scientific inquiry. And lastly is the point on ideological commitments or the role of research in the world more broadly. And here I think there are some challenges or kind of tensions within kind of or between critical theory and critical legal studies. Because critical theory per se does not necessarily, attempt or aims to provide a solution for the problems identified. While I think critical legal studies is more of a political enterprise committed to a more kind of, let's say, a liberal progressive politics. So those are some of the tensions. And I think considering all these tensions, I would like to propose that there are some contributions that I think even thinking together about all that kind of can help, especially with thinking about disciplinary self-reflection. So I think I consider myself more of a cognitive behavioralist scholar from the methodologies that I feel comfortable and that I've applied throughout my career. But in this sense, I think being kind of more deeply exposed to critical theory makes me double think about all the assumptions that I have to apply as I develop my methodologies and as I collect my data. I think in a similar way, critical scholars could also use some of the more kind of scientific, groundings of cognitive behavioral studies, thinking about or reflecting upon some of the ideological commitments moving, some of that type of scholarship. And of course, there is always kind of the theory methodology approach, thinking about how we can measure some things that we didn't really think are measurable and how we can adapt measurements to reflect a more diverse view of scientific progress. And so, because it's almost out of time, I'll just say a few words in how I kind of visualize that kind of merging or contributing process. And so in some of my previous work, I've that focused mostly on kind of aerial vision in military decision-making, I was thinking about how technology and humans interact and how behavioral studies provide some input into how to understand some of the limitations of human-machine interaction in military decision-making processes. And adding on the critical lens here, I think we can look at it as taking some elements in each of those each of those groups. So we can think about some of the technical limitations that are identified through critique sometimes, thinking about the type of lens that we use, how, for example, if we think about aerial vision, it has its own limitations. So for example, when we look, from above to the ground, sometimes it's difficult to see, so you can identify or detect humans on the ground, but some of the details about those humans are then being deleted from the scene or through the lens, right? So it's more difficult when you look vertically to distinguish between adults and children because of, measuring heights is easier from the ground rather than, horizontally rather than vertically. So there are different types of details that are included or excluded through the lens. And those are typically crucial details for the legal norm of distinction. And then we use different technologies in a way that categorize individuals to different legal categories, like civilians, and competence. But to do that, we have to define to the algorithm who is a competent, who is an adult, what is the physical attributes of a male adult body, for example. And so we end in a world where algorithms decide for us how humans look like, what are humans even in that context. And so when we take that sort of kind of critique and apply some of the kind of the cognitive elements, for example, saliency bias or confirmation bias, we can see how this critique then trickles down through decision makers, and how the critique that is kind of a more kind of a broad critique of military technology can then perhaps have unique impact on the actual use of technology through conversations with military decision makers. Because and perhaps just a side note here, that I do a lot of work on military technologies and their limitations, and I often get asked, well, would it have been better without the technologies? And this is absolutely not the argument that I'm making. I think in many ways military technologies provide data that is crucial and that is very helpful. But this data has particular limitations, as critical security studies shown in different ways. And so, and in some of my other work, I look specifically at military investigations that attribute military errors, lethal military errors, to the use of technology. And so it could have been that we had the same mistakes or the same errors or even other worse errors without the technology. But the idea is, and the point that I made with the kind of explaining how military technologies are prevalent in military decision making, is that this is the given, right? This is how we apply international humanitarian law in armed conflict. And so I think it's important to identify some of those limitations, and then we can use cognitive behavioral literature in order to explain how some of those limitations then influence decision makers when they make life and death decisions in real time. And how that then changes how we think about the principle of distinction, for example, and how we apply it in real time. And so I'm happy to go back in Q&A and to talk on any of those incidents, which I've explored in another paper that's titled Above the Law, and looks at drone vision or aerial vision, starting from the bombing, the downing of the Iran air flight in 1988, and then all the way through the attack, the last US attack in Afghanistan on the white Toyota Corolla of Zamaria Mahdi near Kabul. So I'll just end with looking at this last incident that I think can exemplify the argument that I'm making. And so the last, just, in 21 August 2021, I think, it was the last US attack in Afghanistan before the forces were withdrawn. And the tension was high. There were several attacks against US military as they withdrew from Afghanistan. And then there came the intelligence stating that the Taliban forces are planning to attack US forces near Kabul airport as they were withdrawing. And the intelligence mentioned a white Toyota Corolla as the expected vehicle in which the bomb will be delivered. And so US military drones and perhaps CIA drone were then tasked with monitoring the area, looking for that possible culprit. And identifying a white Toyota Corolla, a drone team were then followed that car for about 8 hours before an order was given to attack this car. And days later, following New York Times investigation, it was revealed that the attack was not as successful as initially announced, that the car was the person driving the car was Maria Ahmadi, who was an UN aid worker delivering water for civilian neighborhoods in Kabul, and that all the casualties in this attack, 10 casualties, 7 of them children, were civilians. As a part of the other project that I mentioned, I also looked at the military investigation that followed in this case. And one of the interesting things, it was the first time to my recollection, or with the data that I have, that that the CENTCOM, Central Command Investigation, determined that confirmation bias was partly, a part of the reason for the wrongful attack of this car. And so I think thinking about kind of those types of aerial attacks or drone attack, you can think about the general critique of US violence in Afghanistan. And from a critical approach, the focus is on seeing, like in military, the fact that through the lens of a drone, we see, we kind of generate threat and see civilians as combatants based on the type of lens and the details that are explored and type of threat scenarios that we have, and that legal technological classification then generates, Afghanistan children as combatants based on that, everything that I described before. And so in that space, I was thinking we can take the limitations or the critical approach, thinking about threat generation through technology, and how it then changes how we see individuals in armed conflict zones, but then add on to that this layer of concrete military decision-making that led to this wrongful attack. So for example, thinking about scenario confirmation, right? So thinking about confirmation bias in the sense of the type of intelligence that was delivered and how it was then processed. Thinking about saliency in the type of visuals. For example, if we're looking for a white Toyota Corolla and then we have a white Toyota Corolla on our screens, that's a salient information, even though white Toyota Corollas are quite not unique, let's say, in the streets of Afghanistan. And so I think in this space then, what I think is, and perhaps it's, I think to some extent, and when I present this to critical audiences or to cognitive behavioralists, I always get this sense that they don't really like the merging, right? Because for crits, the idea that we can actually take the critique and then talk to military decision maker, change some of the military organizational culture, change the processes, and then say, well, now this balance is better, is to some extent against the idea of the critique that goes kind of a few levels above, and sometimes I deliver kind of bias bias awareness training to militaries, and in that context also taking the step of the critique is perhaps one step too far, as you are committed to a particular type of technology. So I'll end here just by saying that I think because of those tensions, it's really important in my mind to think more broadly about how we critique military technologies in order to improve military processes and to protect people, humans, not humans, the environment in armed conflict. Thank you.
Thanks, Shiri. That's super. I will avail myself, as is customary of the chair's prerogative, to ask the first question. Let me say, by the way, when you described this project of trying to kind of examine the blend of critical theory and cognitive behavioral work, my first reaction was like, that's not easy. And I really commend what you've done in this paper, not only in focusing on the connections and the similarities, but also really want to praise you for acknowledging some of the inherent tensions in these two approaches. I think that's really quite interesting. Now, let me ask this. When we think about IHL in particular, and you talked about it a little bit in your last few comments, maybe ask you to say a bit more. Critical approaches raise questions, deep normative questions about IHL rules, and in particular suggest that it might be a basis for justifying the kinds of violence that first world countries perpetrate against global South countries. The behavioral critique, in contrast, seems to sort of buy into the rules themselves and say, we're not implementing them very well because of the behavioral issues. So is there a tension between these two critiques, one basically being a kind of a status quo critique or a reformist critique, and the other one being a deeper critique? And then I have a follow-up depending on whether you think there's a question, whether you think there's a tension about that.
Yeah, I do think there is a tension. And I think in another paper that I presented here, I think last year on drone cinema, I've thought a little more deeply on that particular connection between third world approaches to international law and critique. So I think one way, and I think you stated the tension, so I'll say what I think may be a way to overcome some of that tension, is through thinking about advanced military technologies as mainly kind of a Western or first world military advantage, right? And I think the main, or one of the roles that military technologies play is through legitimizing violence, because a violence that is dependent upon advanced military technologies that at least purports to be neutral. I won't say the word objective because that's, tense, but let's say neutral in a way. Thinking about technologies as a neutral exercise in fact finding that allows us to exercise our violence to the best, that we can, to judge, scenarios, putting all sorts of kind of cognitive biases aside, right? Because now it's not the human, it's some sort of algorithm that provides that input. And so this allows us to present types of violence that have been criticized, since the 90s, as better, as kind of a legitimate application of the rules, and even helps us to think about the rules as it kind of legitimize the rules that have been under attack. So the IHL, International Humanitarian Law Project, has been under attack significantly since the 90s, but more intensely in the last decade or so, with books like Samoan's Humane, that basically documents how this is a project that was designed to legitimize Western violence in third world countries. And I think one of the roles of advanced military technologies in this context is to kind of provide kind of re-legitimation of that corpus of law, and present this project as or present military casualties as unintended errors, rather than as kind of a almost unavoidable outcome of applying this sort of technology. And I think, just say one word, that an empirical contribution here, that is, through my studies, one of the things that concerned me most was thinking about how these types of technologies generate threat. And I have, perhaps I'll go to another slide that I saved just for this. Thinking about a Gaza attack, not recent, but still. So this is from 2014, where it was another clash of violence between Israel and Gaza. And in this incident, Israeli drones detected Hamas fighters near a Hamas compound on Gaza beach. And the drones team determined that this was an imminent attack, and so the figures identified on the beach were then targeted and killed. It was then revealed that there were children playing on the beach, and the reason for this attack was, partly or mainly, actually, if you take the idea of the Israeli military investigation outcome, that in this case, because it was a vertical gaze, it was impossible for the drone team to identify those people on the beach as children. But at the same time, it was explained that drone vision was used in this case as a part of the principle of precaution and as a part of application of the principle of distinction in order to identify potential threat as such, or kind of say, no, it's not a threat. And as we use this type of technology, this type of lens, there is a problem of threat generation, because if there wasn't a drone in the air that day, those children would not have been identified as possible threat. Here, they didn't have a concrete, like, let's say, like the white Toyota Corolla intel. So the fact that the drone was surveilling the area generated those children as Hamas combatants, which then kind of created the error that concluded with the targeting of children. And I use this just as an example because the constant surveillance of armed areas of hostilities and armed conflict generates some of those errors by its limitation and by the fact that we constantly scan for potential threats. And so I think if you think about this kind of the way that threat is being now institutionalized through drone surveillance, can help to explain how this is then a part of a more kind of third world critique of international law in the way that it's being applied.
I have more questions, but I want to make sure that I comply with CSEC conventions and open things up. And I think our norm is that we have one of our fellows do the first question. So I'm looking to the fellows. I don't want to have to cold call anybody. And you're a fellow, because I don't know all y'all. Yeah, okay, please go ahead.
The next handful of months, yeah. Okay, thank you, Shiri. This is really, really interesting stuff. So inspired, one suggestion, one question. The suggestion inspired by your point about the crits and the behavioralists don't like the merger, and Alan's first point was there does seem to be an internal tension there. I didn't see it in the paper, but if you're familiar with work on psychology of power, that was initially pioneered by Dr. Keltner in an 2003 paper. And the big takeaway is it's a psychological paradigm, very much experimental, conventional epistemologies. The point is to critique the psychological effects of power, very similar in spirit to the critical project that is skeptical towards power. And some of the effects that they find, which I think fits really nicely with your framework, is that when you feel powerful, or we could imagine leaders of powerful countries, we should expect them to be more biased in general, more prejudiced, more racist. They tend to be more violent. They would tend to use the law in a kind of hypocritical way. So they would project their own ideologies onto others and their moral standards, but then accept themselves from those moral standards. And then a final one is when we feel powerful, we tend to inflate threats. And threat is a big part of this story. So in terms of reconciling the tensions, I think there would be something productive there. And then the question, if I could, is if you had to pick one bias that you think is most responsible for threat inflation, which bias would it be?
Thank you for the comments. So perhaps I should say also that this project was extremely challenging just by trying to narrow down to something feasible within a book chapter of summarizing some kind of critical approaches and some behavioralists, but I think it's a good suggestion under that kind of general limitation. I think so. It's really difficult to kind of come up with like one bias, but in my studies, and I field now an experiment that measures the effect of drone visuals on military decision makers as opposed to other types of information, where I particularly focus on saliency bias. I do think that in military investigations, you can easily identify confirmation bias of different thoughts, of different types, sorry, and kind of different biases that comes under the general name of motivated cognition. So perhaps within the military context, availability bias is one type of bias that is particularly important because, and in that sense, I mean, so in my studies, my studying assumption, which is kind of different from perhaps from a critical approach, and perhaps not, is that these are, what I present here are mistakes, right? So militaries aim to, mitigate civilian harm to the extent possible. And so, some of those kind of technology-related killings are, in fact, unintentional. And so then we can think about the meaning of this unintentionality and whether we can prevent it and whether, whether we should legitimize unintentional killings in war, which is a different question. And so I think within that space, if we take, seriously kind of the point that militaries do aim to mitigate civilian harm, availability bias is one way that we can, actually use in military training, because this talks about all sorts of kind of the way that intelligence information biases then decision-making in real time, and then practice scenarios and how to vary them in a way that, would reduce the, or mitigate to some extent, the occurrence of such biases.
Great, so if you're in the internet land and you have a question, please go ahead and type that in the Q&A, and I'll try to get to that. I see some old friends, Kat, Linda, you know who you are. And then if you could, I'll call on my colleague here, but if you could identify yourself just very briefly before you ask your question, I think that's also part of the CSAC convention.
Yeah, I'm Rod McCoon. And
My PhD supervisor.
this is I was, when I saw the title of your talk, I was trying to think of other papers. What have been some of the classic papers bringing critical perspective and cognitive behavioral perspective together? And I was coming up empty. I mean, there's really very little dialogue between them. I do, and I really liked your analysis, but I do think that one thing that's missing is like giving each community some reason why they ought to actually, like, if you're a fellow in this room, why would you want to collaborate with someone from the other community? Why? And so I was thinking about, what does each side have to bring? And I mean, my own perspective is, for better or worse, I think there are a lot more cognitive behavioral scholars than there are critical scholars. And they're much more likely to get invited to do briefings, to have op-eds. They're much more influential. Even though they're ostensibly less political, they're actually much more politically influential than the critical scholars are. And so that's something I think the critical scholars ought to take note of. Do we just want to preach to the choir and talk to each other, or do we want to actually influence things? And how do we actually get more of a voice? And I have to say, there's some critical people who think it's inherently corrupting to even try to have a voice. So that sort of ends the conversation. But on the cognitive side, I mean, I think there's a big blind spot, and that's the tradition I come from. But there are some big blind spots in the cognitive side that aren't in the critical side. And I think a lot of it is, the cognitive side tends to take tasks as given. And it also tends to be very methodologically individualistic. And so it doesn't think about institutions, and it doesn't think of systems of privilege. So, for example, a social psychologist studying persuasion will study individual attributes that make someone persuasive or not. But they won't look at the fact that, some speakers are given much more benefit of the doubt by audiences and held to lower standards than other audiences, so that institutionally they're not even playing the same game. And so I would encourage you to try to, if you want to bring these communities together, try to get them to think about what their own blind spots are, and because I do think there's a lot of potential for shared interest. When you actually think about actual scholars working in this area, there are a lot of reasons why that collaborations could really be Cool. And so I think it's great. So that's more of a comment, I think.
Thanks, Rob. I'll just say I totally agree. And I think throughout this project, I started thinking it would be much more clear on the benefits. But I think for me personally, it was really the commitment to, you know, advancing what we know and how we think about what we know that we know. And so I want to hope that, you know, this is an aspiration of scholars more generally. And especially as I have to say that as I deliver, you know, trainings to military, senior, you know, military leaders in different countries, it's sometimes really, you know, heartwarming to see how open they are to some of the critical approaches that I then use in my presentations. And for example, I've spoken to aviators and drone pilots, and, you know, one of my students was the commander of the Air Force of Cameroon, and so in some of those engagements, I could see how they completely buy in to some of the critique in a way that surprised me, but saying things like, you know, because of thinking together about the lens, right? And so I've heard from drone operators that the fact that they see the view, but it comes without an audio, sometimes completely changes how they understand what they see, right? And so it can be translated to a behavioral study, but it really comes from, you know, a tradition of critique, thinking about particular types of lens, or, you know, a particular critique of security, you know, critical security studies, thinking about, you know, the limitations of technologies and how they, you know, kind of normalize types of violence, or how they normalize how we see reality in a way. So I think it's interesting to note that there is openness, I think, in practice for this sort of engagement, perhaps more than within scholarly, you know, communities that are committed to a particular type of inquiry. And I think this is partly the motivation that I have in this project.
Mr. Trinkunis.
Thanks, Shiri. Good to see you again. I wonder if another.
Would you identify yourself, sir?
Oh, Harold Trinkunis, Deputy Director here at CSAC. I wonder if another tension that might be inherent in your project of bringing these two different approaches closer together is that it strikes me that the critical theorists are inherently engaged in the project to delegitimize the whole enterprise of using emerging technologies to improve military effectiveness, or to apply the international humanitarian law concepts to the use of these technologies. Whereas the cognitive behavioralists are open to the project being legitimate, but if you just address these biases, or if you just use the technology differently, or if you added new technologies that give you, let's say, a horizontal view, not just a vertical view. So in a sense, the underlying principle is, well, if you just think things a little bit differently, the way we're advising you to, your enterprise will be legitimate. And that strikes me as very hard to reconcile. So I don't know if you agree with that statement, or whether you would see it somewhat differently, or what your thoughts are on it.
I 100% agree with this comment. And it was part of the challenge that I had, right, in kind of trying to bring them together. I think my solution was not ideal, perhaps, for any of those scholarly communities, right? But in my own work, I find that ideally, perhaps, I would like to see the delegitimation, you know, of violence per se and the end to all wars, right? But as long as wars exist, and, you know, we have military technologies that providing both negatives and, you know, and also, you know, some positives as well. So I think I'm benefiting in my critique from, you know, the delegitimation project, let's say, by using it to improve what we already have. And I do think, like I said before, that, you know, for some critical scholars, that would be a misuse, perhaps, of the critique, and perhaps, you know, in a more kind of practical way, the critique would then be used to legitimize, you know, forms of violence. But I think if we are aware of what we're doing and what we're saying, then, you know, we can say these are the limitations. And if we wanted to make some positive impact, you know, we can do that. And if we don't, you know, we can still be aware of the same, you know, of that sort of engagement.
We're doing that. We have a couple of two fingers, so let's take them both together.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't know your name, and then Gili.
That's fine. Johanna Roda-Noack, I'm also one of the postdoctoral fellows here. It's just adding on to Hal's question, because I wanted to ask the same question about going back to the motivation of actually reading these two strands, the cognitive behavioral and the critical, together on what the initial motivation is. You already spoke to this a little bit, because when you come to the implications, I'm not only seeing some risk of tensions, but maybe even actually undermining the critical project, right? So particularly the example that you mentioned about the availability bias and how you could actually use it in military training. I wonder if, I was really struck by what you mentioned about if the drone wouldn't have been there at that day, because we have this constant surveillance, then, you know, there wouldn't have been dead children in the end. And I was wondering if the critical implication of this wouldn't have been if, you know, the baseline surveillance is one of the problems that you identify, wouldn't it mean that the solution is not to look, for example? And similarly with the improving of targeting and vision, for example, there's a paper by what's his first name, also Gregory, but not Derek, in Auckland. Thomas, thank you, Thomas Gregory, about how casualty counting from drone strikes by the coalition was actually used to then calibrate violence to be more effective in the end. So an improvement of targeting here that you could, you know, if you identify all the limitations of cognitive behavioral things and you use them to actually, you know, train the military, improve technology, et cetera, could then use to do exactly the things even more efficiently that you're trying to undermine with the critical projects. I'm wondering how, you know, only in the epistemological setup, I have tensions here, but maybe even in the implications in the end on how what you essentially come out with, your results could be weaponized for exactly the opposite thing that your critical project wants to achieve.
And then Gili, you get the next one.
All right, so fast. I thought of a way of bringing the two together, which is I couldn't fail to notice that the examples were all, you know, a state using top-notch technology, but drones are for everyone, right? And so we do know of non-state entities using drones for their own purposes. And I wonder if any of this is applied to such a case. Like, did anyone check if Hezbollah, for instance, is prone to, you know, false positive biases? And so maybe that's a good way of bringing both together, just to force them to apply this for, you know, a non-state actor behavior.
You get the last one. Actually, I'm gonna get the last one.
Always.
Okay, so I'll just start with Gili because that's the easier one. Thank you. I think it's a great idea. The main problem is, and this is a problem that I have generally with the type of research, is information. I'm sure as a military historian, you know too well the difficulty of, you know, getting some of that information. And so the research in this space is limited by what we can know. And it's, of course, as much as it is difficult sometimes to find out what states are doing, it's more difficult to find out what states are doing if they're not democracies and do not have Freedom of Information Acts. And then it becomes more and more difficult depending on, you know, the type of body and the type of transparency that they, you know, have. But as an idea, I think, you know, it's tempting to look what's available. With regard to undermining the critical project, and this is, I think I said it perhaps like, I don't know, 4 times, you know, through the presentation, I know. And I've heard that from, you know, critical scholars as I've, you know, kind of presented this or started thinking even, you know, with colleagues about this project. So I'll just say that I don't think that it necessarily undermines, and I think it's I think to say that if we try to, you know, improve our civilian harm mitigation processes, that then we are creating more violence, I think I would find it difficult to empirically prove. I think that attempts to mitigate civilian harm are genuine, and I think they are important. And so in that sense. And at the same time, I think that, you know, first world violence has been, you know, legitimized and perhaps unjustly so. I think that we should, and in some previous studies I've argued against the principle of proportionality and against the idea that we should prefer unintended or unintentional violence over intentional violence. And I think that we should not think about violence as what was expected, but what's the outcome of the violence. And so I do have, you know, some critique that goes to the heart of how we wage war. But because this is the world we live in and we do wage war, at the same time that I think this critique is valid, I'm also happy to speak to militaries on ways where they can reduce some of those errors. And so I think the two can, you know, coexist. I know that internally within my, you know, brain, they do coexist because I do, you know, share that that kind of more the broader critique. And at the same time, I think that militaries can do better, and, you know, we should help militaries do better. You know, considering that the general critique, you know, we can say it out loud, but it doesn't really change much in reality.
I think this brings us to the end of our time. So with my last word, I would just comment or observe that the kind of work that Shiri is doing at the intersection of behavioral and cognitive studies and law and international law in particular, I think is very important and very bold. I was very proud to see it kind of take off during her time here at Stanford Law School. And then just to ask you to join me in thanking Shiri for being here.